So we'll start with the Om. Thank you for joining. This is Ask Akil in March. Om represents the infinite. Three times loud and long together. Breathe in. May that intelligence that guides all the rhythm of nature guide and protect us as we do these practice. Right? We have this conversation together. May we acquire the energy, the intelligence to realize the knowledge. May we develop a strong desire for liberation. May we cherish no ill feelings towards each other, ourselves, or any beings anywhere. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So the format of this experience is kind of open. So if someone has a question about something or a comment or some food for thought, you're welcome to share that. Otherwise, I'll just riff because I always have things to say. So I want to open it up to y'all and see, is there any practice question or practical question or philosophical question that you might have? And we'll just go from there.
I have somewhat of a question. I don't really know how to ask it, but I've been working on this idea and this concept of ease. And I realized that ease is not very easy. Or it's not that it's not easy, but I guess the thing is I'm realizing I really don't know ease, if that makes sense. And I was just wondering if there was any words or anything that you had around ease, because that's just where I'm focusing on right now. And I guess just to give a little backstory, not too long, is just that I feel as though I don't want to put in as much effort or as work as it seems like it's necessary to accomplish things. And I'm noticing that I have this block in my mind that still feels that there has to be a lot of work. If I don't do a lot of work or things, and it's not really going to get done. So I guess surrendering into ease, I'm finding the challenge into really understanding it and surrendering. So just wanted to see what you had to say around that.
I am so grateful that you brought that up. That is, as you're describing this relationship that you have with ease and how it's not easy to be easeful, right? And it makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you naming that because, my initial response to that is that we are operating in a culture that imbues us with these beliefs and values that you're not allowed to rest, or that, and if you want to have success, you have to work hard for it, and that it's required for you to put in energy to then get out energy. And that kind of goes back to this agrarian society understanding of nature, right? And what I mean to say by that is that if we're operating with the culture that we have historically inherited from the last 100,000 years, we're looking at a culture of agrarian people who farmed, whose livelihoods was the way we represent it in our minds, or the way it's historically given to us, is as toil, right? Most people struggled constantly. Like if you had a bed, it's because you made that bed. Like now you can go buy a bed, or wherever you go and stay somewhere, there's the bed for you, right? We have this very different world that we're inhabiting, but we still have these ideas and these identifications with very old world that we inherited. So that's part of it. And the culture that we have, especially around capitalism, teaches us that if you want to have success, you have to like struggle and strive, and then we bring that ethos into the sense of yoga practice, which is pre-capitalism, pre-agriculture. It's older than this way of thinking, because yoga is not necessarily like yoga in the sense of it comes from the Indian like subcontinent area. This is a human cultural universal practice, which is built to try to help us to have a relationship with nature, larger sense of nature, but ourselves in the context of that, which is timeless. So it goes beyond these modern sensibilities that we have in the sense of like how we are trying to form a relationship with that. And so your comment about you are noticing a resistance to putting in effort towards things that you don't know whether they will bring you success or not, it's actually like um it's interesting. Like when I look at, there's one very famous yoga scripture called Vashishta Yoga. It's like this real big, very long book, and it says in there, and Ramana Maharshi also, this very prolific awakened figure in the 20th century actually, so that self-realization, this recognition of our nature as nature, is comes through both self-effort and grace. And when we look at the practices around self-effort, it's not hustle culture, it's not burnout culture like we have now. It's being thoughtful and diligent and paying attention and observing, giving and receiving feedback, because that's what nature does. Like if you look at the natural world, um, like it's a beautiful time for you to ask this question, because we're at the change of a season, where the energy in the plants and the animals around us is naturally shifting because of the way that the sun's light is hitting the earth. And there's no waste of energy in that. There's never any over or under efforting, in the sense that like the organism of a plant is always giving itself and receiving feedback through its own being and from the environment around it. So if it overproduces sugars and it goes and it grows too much, but it can't sustain that growth, it cuts back. And we have sort of lost touch with how that is for us as human beings, because we're living so much in ideas, and our lives are not really um, at the pace of like your life or my life. They're at the pace of like the standard of life, which doesn't have anything to do with you or me. It's a construct, it's an idea. And so we're trying to live our lives inside and around ideas that have absolutely nothing to do with what is appropriate for you or me in the moment that we're in, which is a very different way of approaching effort. And effort in that sense is like not exhausting. It is easeful because it is for your own nourishment. We especially now, like where we don't have to make effort to grow our own food, so we're sort of disconnected from the chain of effort and energy that goes into nourishing ourselves. We've sort of lost an understanding of this basic understanding of nourishment. That nourishment is not something that um, is like it's like gas in the tank. That's not what nourishment is. Nourishment is like what helps you to feel grounded and present and steady and available and open, curious, creative, and to process the experience of being alive. That's not gas in the tank, right? This isn't a vehicle like a car, but the culture that we have largely is so geared towards go, 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 produce, produce, produce. You're a little cog inside of this large machine. You're not a cell in an organism. You're not a membrane. So, it makes sense that you would have this difficult relationship with ease because we have a difficult relationship with ease. And I appreciate you listening to me sort of ramble about that, but the the thing that I want to highlight is that because we are a product of the forces of nature, which are the reason why there are planets and stars. It's the reason why space exists. It's the intelligence behind what brings amino acid chains together that form proteins, which makes life happen. That is so precise and so creative and effective that it made it possible for organisms like us to exist. And we're a product of that. We're not at all separate from that. And so making effort to connect with that at work within ourselves in how our mind works and in how our body works and in the relationships that we have is so incredibly valuable. But it's not seen as valuable in the world that we have. But it is. And you know, to start putting effort and energy into that, which doesn't immediately bring you gratification or success, seems very countercultural and not productive and sometimes really selfish, depending on where you are in your process. But if you keep going with that process, you start to recognize like what is actually appropriate for you. And this is the discernment that is so critical to practicing yoga. And then just imagine the world where everybody had an accurate and available capacity for discernment to know how to put in energy and effort towards things that are nourishing. Just imagine what the world would be like. And it won't happen through making rules and through creating systems and things like that, because that isn't how the natural world really operates. It's not operating in these intellectual constructs. It's operating in how much sugar is available inside this plant body. What do I need to do to get the sugars? Which symbiotic relationship in the soil do I need to tap into? Like what's actually available? And that's a very different way of living. And I think it's okay to step out of the modern ideology of like you have to work this way and that success means this. And what this practically means in the sense of practice is notice the thoughts and beliefs you have around effort and engage with them in a way that creates more spaciousness for you. So if the thought that like I have to work really hard to experience success is going around in your head, notice how that's making you feel. It probably makes you feel shitty. And then see if you can find space within the thought to introduce openness, which means, in a practical sense, like think a different thought about that. Like if you recognize like, okay, my success is not a product of my doing or not doing something. My success is a product of how I feel about myself. Then you've disconnected your effort from success, which means you have a lot more space. And then when you think about efforting, like if you look at your effort as like, okay, I'm putting energy towards what is nourishing me. So you have to know what's nourishing for you. You have to think differently about this. Does that make sense?
I really like that a lot. Yeah, because when you're speaking about it, what's coming up is this push and pull I've had consistently my whole life around it, because I've always wanted to do things my own way. I always have done things my own way, but that doesn't mean I don't feel guilt and shame around doing it or feel pressured into like showing up and like trying to put in a lot of effort, and then it throws me off balance, and then I have to again like find where I'm supposed to be, and then it just seems like it takes so much time to regain that balance in my space that I feel like I lost all this time in what I was doing before, and I'm like, where did I lose the balance? And then it's interesting that you said discernment, because this year I was thinking about making my word discernment, but I didn't like how discernment focuses on like choosing this or that. And I'm not a very black and white person. So I chose the word insight instead, and finding like, the like discernment inside of myself through like own inner understanding. And yeah, and so I really like what you're saying. And yesterday I went out for a really long drive. I ended up doing an 8-hour loop in the mountains and found myself meditating on this river in the middle of nowhere, and watching the snow melt. And I was there and I was like, this is it. This is the ease I've been looking for, is just sitting here. And I was like, this is why I made all the moves to be where I am right now, because I could not find balance in my previous environment. And I had to come someplace, but still somehow I get thrown into the technosphere and I end up getting thrown off balance again. So I'm liking what you're saying. I wrote down that about, really thinking around the different thoughts around effort too, because I still have to like show up for my work and I'm like not wanting to. So there's still something there. And I think that this idea of really reflecting what I'm thinking on and changing it is going to help. So thank you.
Yeah, there's so many things in what you said that I appreciate, and there's so many places where I like have a comment about something, and I'll share. So, like, you were saying that um, that you found yourself being pulled away from the stuff that actually is nourishing for you because you're engaging with work and who you are in relationship to the world around you and how other people's perceive you, right? There's so much judgment and guilt in it because we have this idea of like, I am who I am because of what people tell me I am, or I am who I am in relationship with how I am in the world. It's all externally based. It's so interesting, right? And that happens very unconsciously. It's, we I think all human beings do that because that's what feels safe for us. It's very difficult to actually form a relationship with what doesn't have any, points of reference, right? That's why we do that. And what becomes really challenging about that is if all the points of reference for us don't actually feel nourishing for us because they're not appropriate for where we are in our process, then we get confused, right? And there's there's something really interesting about that, and it's that um, we 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 know ourselves through the feedback that we get from the world around us, but what we do with that feedback is within our capacity, and that's where discernment becomes important, because discernment isn't necessarily like this or that. I think discernment is the skill to see the difference between what is a production of this long chain of ideas and what is present regardless of ideas, and like then it's not black and white in that sense, because there's a lot of gray in that. There's a lot of like, okay, like I can see, for example, um, like if I hold up a light bulb, I don't have a light bulb handy, but if I hold up a light bulb and you see this object in your brain, you have a story about what this means. And that is connected with a whole series of different ideas. Like, what do you do with it? Who built it? How bright is it? There's all these ideas in it. But then there's what it is. And what it is an object, right? And we create a meaning for things because it's useful to us, but it often gets us confused. And we create meaning for ourselves as well, but it often gets us confused. So that's where we have space to put in like curiosity and openness, and not like the idea of curiosity and openness, but the experience of that. Like, what does it feel like to be curious? You know, to not know something. What does it feel like to not have a sense of something? That's not easy to put into words, but it's something that we can actually tap into because we all know what that is. And then the other thing that you said I found really interesting was like you made a point to go out and be with nature, because nature reminds us of like, yeah, what is actually important to me. And like your example is so beautiful, it's so rich, right? And then what does a person who lives in a urban setting do if they can't get in a car and drive for 8 hours and all that? You go outside and you look up, or you look down at the grass, or if you're in your home, you look at a plant. It like the capacity for us to connect with this is very easy, but we don't, because we're caught up in the world of ideas all the time, you know. And the last thing I wanted to say is like about work and like where you're putting your effort and energy. It's like you can, this is what I love about the Bhagavad Gita. There's a passage or a line in there that says like, a person who has had the experience of self-realization operates in the world exactly the same way that someone who hasn't. In fact, they recognize that it is not their place to disturb other people in their process. You know, that's why they have compassion. And another way of saying this is, there's this adage that says, what does the monk do before enlightenment? Chops wood and carries the water. And then what does the monk do after enlightenment? Chops wood and carries the water. And it's just to say, like, it isn't a matter of what we're doing. You could do anything. You could be like, you could make cotton candy for a living. You know, it could be that simple, but you could be free in it. You could feel successful. You could feel nourished. And that isn't about what you're doing or not doing. That's about your idea of yourself and the story you're telling yourself. And it's not easy to really get at some of that stuff. There's so much pulling us out all the time. So that's why discernment is so valuable, because it's like you're connecting with what is open, you know, what has possibility, where's freedom in it. Because ideas and constructs and things, they don't have a lot of room to wiggle, right?
I like
Go ahead.
I wanted to say that one of my favorite definitions of insight is the act or fact of apprehending the inner nature of things or seeing intuitively, clear and immediate understanding. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks for defining that.
Yeah, and then the etymology of it is the sight with the eyes of the mind, mental vision, understanding from within, the meaning felt as sight into something else. And so the sense shifted to penetrating understanding into the character or hidden nature.
Yeah, and the faculty of discernment is what creates insight.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I'm getting from what you were saying.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that.
I have a sort of unrelated question. I've been feeling a lot of laziness and avoidance, which isn't anything new, but particularly around just yoga practice in general. And so I'm curious, like, what good advice is around laziness and yoga and just like not wanting to do the physical practice.
That is an excellent and always present aspect of practice, I think. And it, you know, just not just physical practice, but uh like actually making that effort, you know, like this really like about how do you consistently make effort is how I would phrase that question. And What keeps us consistent in anything is if we see it as important for us, which means like not what happens if I do or don't do this, because that's not it. It's like, why is this important for me to do? What is this helping or hurting me? How is this helping or hurting me? And when it becomes clear to you how something is actually supporting you in like being present and being available for what life is, and like allowing yourself to experience your own thriving and your own resilience, like that is a motivation all by itself. So then the question isn't like, how do I make myself do practice? The question is, how do I want to experience my own thriving? And like, what do I need to make effort in to experience that? And then it becomes much different. That question isn't like, why do I need to do all these physical things? Because that might not be what helps you to thrive. That might just be like, spinning your wheels in place, which is useful sometimes, right? If you have an excess amount of energy, you got to use that energy towards something. Otherwise, you get weird in the head. But otherwise, it might be like, what is actually nourishing me and helping me to show up completely? What do I need to make a commitment to that will help me to show up completely for myself? To be my own like cheerleader, or to have my own back, and that can look and feel a whole lot of different ways. And so I think what I valued so much about doing the various different trainings that I've done is that being exposed to this like library of different kinds of practices, I realized some practices really resonate with me and some don't. And some work great for me for some time and then they really don't. And so I have to know for myself what is useful for me in the moment that I'm in. And that's where the feedback part comes in, right? If we're really listening to like what our real need is, like what do I need in order to feel settled right now? If we're really listening to that, then we're in a position to choose it instead of feeling obligated, which is like, I learned this about myself years ago. If I feel obligated towards something, I don't want to do it. I'm out. I'm just like, if I am supposed to or I have to do something, forget about it, because that feels really limiting and imprisoning. And in the context of like many relationships, that's like a huge one, right? So that's a huge deal, whether it's friendship or whatever, like work, whatever. So if I reframe this for myself and I see like, what am I inspired to do? I have a lot of freedom and flexibility and choice there. Then it's like, this is the situation that's present for me. What am I inspired to do with this? And then follow that. So when I notice this, like, oh, I have to do this, blah, feeling come up, I just ask myself, like, what am I actually inspired to do right now? And inspiration, like insight, comes from discernment also, right? Because it's your inner feedback loop telling you like, this is actually feeling really good right now, or this feels like, it's stimulating for me. And I want to be clear about using the word stimulating. Stimulating is not pleasure, right? If you ask me if doing yoga asana practice is pleasurable, I would tell you yes and no. Because it's pleasurable in the sense that I feel like I have showed up for myself in a way where I otherwise would not have. I have cultivated a kind of self-confidence that I would not have experienced had I not done those things. And what I mean by self-confidence is I have my own back. I trust in myself enough to keep doing what I'm doing, and I'm willing to show up to whatever is going to happen. That's what I mean. And And the no part is like, it's uncomfortable physically. It's time demanding. It like I would love to, my brain would love to sit down and watch a bunch of TV instead. It would, or just like eat a bunch of cookies. Like, you know, the sugar receptor on my tongue is like highly attuned. And I know this about my body, but I'm not always seeking gratification or pleasure, because that doesn't feel good all the time either. You know, and the only way we understand this is by like engaging with those, you know, like I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but you know, there's the word yoga is union with our inner nature, right? That's the context of that word. And the word boga is union with the world. So that's a whole kind of spiritual practice too. What we have most exposure to is the right hand path of yoga, which is like, you know, austere, and you do these practices and you meditate and you eat the right things and, you know, that kind of thing. And like your devotion comes from this like lofty kind of ideal place, which is wonderful and it moves some people. But then on the other side of that is boga, which is like you engage with everything. So you can meet devotion through intoxication. That's why you have ascetics or yogis who are like smearing themselves with the ash of cremated bodies, and they're smoking the chillum, which is like weed or hash, you know, because it puts them in this sort of ecstatic place where they're able to contact their devotion. Or like even alcohol is used in that. So, you know, it's like there's so many different ways to practice, but that is like very is very against the very puritanical Western sensibility that we have. And imperialism, Western ideology, you know, we had this sort of moment in the class before this, like West is not really West because that's just an idea, right? But it's this sort of like imperialist idea of like what's proper, what is appropriate, what is holy, what's not holy, that being projected into the world of like this very interesting absorption practice of yoga or self-realization. It's an absorptive practice, but it can happen through many different channels. And like, you know, just imagine if the practice, you went to a yoga studio and everyone got so high they became ecstatic with the presence of the divine. You know, you wouldn't have yoga studios all over the place. You just wouldn't. You know, so it's not to say that isn't a valid form of practice, because it is. It's just that that is not everyone's practice either. Like for me, I would have coughed up a lung a long time ago, you know. So so, you know, it's a long answer to your very short question, but I think that the point is like, what is inspiring for me? You know, what inspires me to show up in this moment? And that's not always an easy thing to answer, but it's a valuable question to ask.
I really appreciate the like what inspires me right now question, because I think in a lot of ways I guess I am practicing in my own way, because I am feeling very inspired by other things that just like aren't the physical practice in this moment. So yeah, I really liked that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that so much, because like, I think we have this misunderstanding of practice entirely, that the point of the practice is to reach a certain place. You know, like you're able to sit without moving for 3 hours, like that you've achieved this. And then when you're able to be still in that way, then your mind becomes serene. You know, that's like a really great story. But at the same time, it's not very attainable for most people, and then you feel guilty about that, right? Which then keeps you from practicing. But I think when the goal of yoga is to experience life as uh, as reverence and devotion for whatever it is that made it possible for us to be alive, that can happen through anything. It can happen through anything. Like, it can happen through relationships. It can happen through art. It can happen through movement. It can happen through sitting. It can happen through eating or singing or dancing, anything, right? There's so many ways to experience reverence for being alive. And that's why we're here. You know, when it's said, like, we're not here to suffer, that's what it's about. And the suffering is what keeps us from experiencing the reverence and the devotion. So when we're doing practice, we are gradually taking down the barriers to keep us from celebrating being alive. So the question isn't like, how do I make myself practice? It's like, how do I want to celebrate being alive? So we have just a couple of minutes left. So we'll just sit in that for a second. Just take a moment to like sit with that. What is it that you want to do to help yourself celebrate being alive? That has nothing to do with anybody else, right? Like what anybody else thinks or what they feel or their ideas about you. So at its heart, these practices are really gateways to experiencing joy. And joy is the spontaneous recognition of the experience of being alive and how magical that is. So may we find through our discernment, through our inspiration and insight, a pathway for us to experience and embody that spontaneous joy that is already present there, that cannot be taken from us. It is not a product of our effort, it is our nature. We'll conclude with an Om and 3 Shanti. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May we be receptive to that inner joy, that intelligence that's present equally in all beings everywhere. Some people call that God. Be receptive to the grace of God.
Thank you.